Thank you. I didn't really know quite what I was going to be doing at a hybrid session of this kind. Mark said talk about Irish manuscripts, but an opportunity to talk to book designers encouraged me to ride one or two hobby horses, which I shall do early, and then talk about Irish manuscripts in a way that relates to those hobby horses. For a long time, my historical and literary interests, which are very, very hard to classify, are categorized by seeing things very much in a multi-layered way. And you know, if you get your hands on the O'Flaherty book later this year, you'll find that I'm taking a body of correspondence and working forwards from it and backwards from it and downwards from it and then outwards from the downwards. And it involves very long notes, and it will have to have a good index. But it explores the riches of how things connect and lead on and lead on. And to do that, one needs a complex page. So for as long as I've been using books seriously, I've always loved books that have footnotes and side notes and footnotes to footnotes. I don't know how many of you will have come across the works of Thomas Amory, Irish-born 18th century writer. Impossible to categorise. One doesn't know how much of any aspect of his life is fiction. I suspect half his biography is fiction. A work, what's it called? The Lives of Some Ladies of Great Britain, or Monuments of Antiquity, 1755, has a wonderful excursus imitating Martin on the Western Isles, or The Life of John Buncle, Esquire, 1756, Volume 2, 1766, feminist, Unitarian, and full of extraordinary things, mathematics, Irish, but with footnotes that run across page after page after page, and with footnotes to those footnotes. Well, Amory's barking mad, but I do like to see a book that allows me, as it were, to read a central text and to see, as it were, the subsidiary narratives going on in footnotes and side notes. And I think, as far as beauty is concerned, late 17th century printers had really got there in being able to do this very well. Some wonderful Greek editions, Greek or Latin editions from the Sheldonian press in the 1680s and 90s are marvellous works. But for the kind of thing I'm generally doing, it's the mid to late 19th century into early 20th century that provided a lot of the apparatus that really helps the reader. Text with big footnotes, but big footnotes printed in 2 columns so that the eye doesn't have to struggle with following small type across full measure. Side notes that when you're trying to find a particular discussion help you navigate through things quickly. Running heads that change from page to page. This sort of thing has pretty much gone from books in the second half of the 20th century. The VCH in England, I suppose, carries on the 2-column footnotes, but that's a hangover from an earlier age. My day job, when I'm not entertaining myself with Irish antiquaries, is to work on medieval charters, 11th and 12th century charters from the Anglo-Norman realm, and medieval library catalogues. I have 16 volumes out of a 22-volume series on medieval library catalogues, which present very, very complex challenge. The text of a catalogue can be itself complex. Every aspect of it will need teasing out, and it has to be very precisely indexable, indexed to the line and half line, to the sub-entry with a catalogue item. And in doing this kind of work, I've always had to do all my thinking of how I put the complexity of the text and what I'm trying to get out of the text onto the page. Even, as it were, thinking up for myself levels of punctuation. I want something that's bigger than colon and full stop. Where do we use the solidus? Where do we use spaced M-dashes? In articulating things in a blocked note on a complex entry. Editing a 13th century Union catalogue, for example, you have to explicate the copies that are being represented by simple numbers in the Union catalogue. And I've never had a designer. It's always been left to me to do it, and I do it on the basis of comparing the work of some contemporaries that can be pretty unsatisfactory. Again, no designers. David Smith had a comment on the standard of design in academic books, I think, earlier today. I've seen really, really rubbish design in presenting medieval charters, and it comes down to the editor not thinking about what was needed to put that material over. But 40 years ago, someone like the OUP, the editor would have had to deal with someone in the printing division who would have had a great deal more sense. And that sort of thing is just not made available to us now. I think I've done all right with my medieval library catalogues, but they're published by the British Library, where they do handle designed books. I don't know what will happen with OUP and the charters. So that's the background that I like to see lots of layers of things conveniently placed for the eye. One has to present the stuff so that the reader can make sense of it immediately and without having to turn to an explanation at the front of the book, especially if you're talking multi-volumes, as I am. So, Irish manuscripts. This sort of issue is not new. It's not even something that goes back to printing. I'll use Irish examples here, but I could talk about these sort of issues with examples from other countries. Some classics from 12th, 13th century Paris would be available. But here we go. Now, this book, you may recognise the opening of St. John's Gospel from Kells, had a designer, but you're not meant to read it. If you don't know what it says, turn over quickly. In principio erat verbum, and then at the last line, I'm saying et verbum because I know the next page begins erat. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word over the page was with God. But you're not there to read it. You're there to engross yourself in all this intricacy. If you ever got the chance to see it. In the last 50 years, this has been more accessible than it ever was before. And surely the maker of it could never have foreseen that level of accessibility. This, a manuscript I rather prefer, I think is... this is good reading script, written 807-808 by Verdovnach for the Abbot of Armagh. This is from the patrician dossier in the Book of Armagh, whose whereabouts we know about pretty well throughout its history from the 9th century to today. And the scribe is quite seriously calligraphic. If you look at the just above the middle of the left-hand column, Incipiunt libri sancti patricii episcopi ego patricius peccator rusticissimus. It is legible, but you have to keep your wits about you. The whole of the Book of Armagh was reproduced in print in 1913. And the editor I can't even imagine what his transcript looked like, but the signals to the printer to use outsized letters and so on must have made it an extraordinarily difficult typographical job to represent the manuscript page by page, line by line, word by word, letter by letter, including alterations and marginal notes like the Z you see at the top right. You can put the two in parallel. Potiti the name of Patrick's grandfather, Potiti, with these extraordinary calligraphic T's. You won't find that Z-like T elsewhere. This is a scribe who was aiming to look good as well as, I think, be readable. This is another scribe in the same manuscript, Scribe A, and he's taking advantage of the complete power that you have in manuscript to lay out your page ad hoc as you want it. He's got a list of names and he's planned them into 3 columns, taking up more or less the space of 1 column. He's eaten into his margin, but he's not reduced the width of his left-hand column, and it finishes. The list doesn't continue on the next leaf. So he must have counted up his names. He's got a couple in the lower margin. He decided that 3 columns was the best fit, but he could have decided to spread over onto the next page or lay it out in other ways if he'd wanted to. That's simply the same thing translated into print. And you can see from the print that the number of words in those columns is actually slightly denser. He's ignored his line rulings to some extent and gone down. But if I go back, you don't see 3 or 4 lines in the bottom margin in the manuscript in the way that you do in the printed copy. That's just a leaf for which I've got no reproduction of the manuscript. With the genealogy from the beginning of St. Matthew's Gospel, and he's using quite a lot of spacing there. It's all really to achieve the look that he wants rather than to communicate anything particularly complex. There, it's all look, and it does become quite hard to read. The end of St. John's Gospel is here. And we've got quotations from Gregory the Great's Moralia at either side. And the stuff at the top, I haven't found, but it's got GG at either side, so that should be Gregory the Great too. Today is the feast day of St. Gregory the Great, by the way. And in the middle there, the calligraphy has really taken over, and one does begin to wonder how legible that would be. You know, if you were using this for the lesson, you might have the problem that Tim O'Neill mentioned. And there is this translated into print. And whoever thought this was a good idea, I don't know. But the previous experience of facsimiles in Ireland would have been the 1870 and 1880 facsimiles of things like the Book of Leinster, which were achieved by paying Joseph O'Longan to copy the manuscript page by page, line by line, word by word, letter by letter, in black ink on white paper, from which they could then etch plates. They hadn't got a photographic process. This was perhaps cheaper. Now, here, a little bit later, this is towards the end of the 9th century, that was beginning, this is the St. Gallen Priscian, one of the 3 great continental codices carrying Irish glosses. Priscian is a difficult Latin grammatical text, explaining higher grammar, and the glosses, there are thousands of glosses in Irish and in Latin, but the manuscript, I think, was not specially laid out to take them. It was written with a reasonably comfortable space, but I think it would have had that sort of comfortable space anyway. Though, whatever it was copied from, the glosses are not all primary glosses in this manuscript. There are linguistic forms in the glosses that take you back to archaic Irish rather than Old Irish, so they would have been written down 200 years earlier than this. So the glosses are being copied, possibly from the exemplar, possibly from a second copy of the same work. That just gives you a bit more detail. The chances of reading these glosses, well, it's pretty difficult. You need magnifying glasses. Or, in the last 12 months, the Swiss government has paid for an amazing website that has the St. Gallen manuscripts live, and you can go through 4 tiers of magnification, including 2 levels higher than this. Brilliant stuff. Now, that I would have called, that I would call an insular hand, certainly in Irish, but in terms of general appearance, quite like you might find an Anglo-Saxon writing at the same time, an Anglo-Saxon writing English or Latin in the mid to late 9th century. Whereas here we've gone distinctively Irish, and you have a very big formal text script. This is the Psalter of St. Cameen. You have some interlinear glosses, see, but not every line by any means is glossed. You have outline as annotation at the top in a smaller hand, and this marginal annotation running all the way round. This is late 10th century, beginning of the 11th century. It's the first manuscript after a period of silence, really. And then this takes us a bit later from, I pinched this from Irish Script on Screen, which is another wonderful resource. It's the Franciscan copy of the Irish Liber Hymnorum, Killiney A2, I think, now in UCD, of course. And the text is the Altus Prosator from the late 7th century Latin stanzas, and after each stanza you get a block of annotation. And the block of annotation varies in length, and he's adjusted the size of script to accommodate it. But he has to know how much. You know, he's operating on the basis of judging what space to leave between stanzas, or else copying the annotation following the exemplar. Occasionally you can see imperfections. And did he just tuck that under because he didn't want to use another line, or had he not left enough space, or did he think that was the right way to do it anyway? This is the same manuscript, but I've now gone a few leaves ahead to an Irish text. So we have the text in text size. It has its introduction, an explanation of what it is in Irish, and you see the start at the left there of marginal commentary. And that marginal commentary is quite extensive, and it carries on down the left-hand side of the page, but doesn't infect the right-hand page. How far that was planned, I don't know. The same annotation is found in the other copy we have of these texts. So one might well think, yes, there's an exemplar behind the two copies are roughly contemporary. There's an exemplar behind it. At some level, there ought to be planning behind these. And that takes us to the end of the text and the commentary introducing the next text, Cantemus in omni die. We've changed back to Latin. That's the way the Liber Hymnorum is. It moves between the two languages pretty freely. This is a less well-known manuscript, Oxford Rawlinson B505. The Oxford Irish manuscripts are not on the Irish Script on Screen. Most of them are available through the early manuscripts side of the Bodleian website, but not this one, because it's just the back leaf of a large Latin manuscript, and I'm afraid I think the people organising the digitisation didn't read far enough down the catalogue to realise there was 12th century Irish material. The text here is Félire Aengusa, the Martyrology of Aengus. Each line of script represents 4 lines of verse, a metrical quatrain. And you can see we've got little bits of interlinear glossing. This is a work with commentary of some bulk. So that the previous slide showed you January, and then this is the commentary on January and the introduction to the next month. And the amount of interlinear glossing increases. You can see the start of February has more. The page is beginning to look quite peppered. And then the block of commentary on the stanzas for that month. Each verse commemorates the saints of a particular day. And that's blown up so that you can see some of the busyness going on, and the marks to articulate where notes are going to be hung on to it. So you've got something there structured to invoke the annotation. The text in print, well known in print, Whitley Stokes 1880 in 4 columns, and Stokes 1905 with the Henry Bradshaw Society. More of the same thing. We've probably had enough of that one. But here, I hope the detail is enough to show how he does it. The ruling of lines is the same regardless of the size of script. For text, he writes touching both lines and would leave a blank between the 2 lines for his spacing. But where he's doing notes, he uses each line and the script sits on the line and doesn't touch the line above. So he can rule his page without having to work out how many lines he needs at one height or another. And the same principle is applied even in very elaborate Parisian glossed Bibles of the 1160s and 70s, which have blocks of text running all the way around the page. This is the Book of Leinster. The Book of Leinster, for the most part, left Ireland in the 17th century. One bit of it containing saints' lives, martyrologies, went to Louvain, and the main part went with Edward Llwyd to Oxford. They've both come back to Ireland subsequently, but this is the Killiney part. Irish script on screen for Trinity says, what we really wanted here was the Book of Leinster, but what we've got is 28 medical manuscripts. So this is from the Killiney component. And this is a martyrology. For each date you get the names of saints. Now, under a single date for Chechmunu, there are 240 names, and he's gone in for 7 columns. In the Trinity component, he does genealogies of the saints, and that's in 7 columns. But if he's got this saint traced back 30 generations and his 15th cousin, he'll trace the cousin back 15 generations and then use a signe de renvoi to tell you where you go to find the earlier 15 generations. So he was saving on space, but he hadn't really worked out how to lay out genealogies. This is Sharpe's Mar, where you can see the large script represents the core text, the 8th century law text. And that text has been studied in law schools for centuries since the 8th century, and manuscripts have built up a mixture of glosses and commentaries, and some of the same material will be found in commentary manuscripts where you simply get snippets of text and more commentary. Printing this sort of stuff is quite challenging. The 2 editions of law tracts that have really attempted it as books, Bechflether and Urjocht Narir, rely on breaking the thing down into small segments and interspersing the gloss and commentary material. But they have also these days to introduce a translation. And the texts of these law tracts is really quite difficult to understand. So translation essential, and some of them exist in 2, 3, 4 manuscripts. So if you start thinking of bringing in textual variants and a parallel translation, you can see that the complexity required for something like this is pretty daunting. And I don't think any of the editions, either in Eriu or those 2 modern ones from the Institute, have fully mastered it. But of course, one won't have had the benefit of anyone who understands design or expressing these things on the page involved in putting the thing together. And I'll stop there. All right?